Welcome back. Everything around you has a secret past. Today we're going to uncover one of them. The night sky over northern Saint-Domingue is not supposed to be orange. It is August 22, 1791, and the richest colony on the face of the earth is on fire. Not one plantation. Not 10. Over 1,000 of them burning in sequence, until the horizon itself looks like it's bleeding. Enslaved men and women who spent their entire lives cutting cane for other people's coffee cups are standing in the firelight with torches in their hands, watching the wealth of an empire turn to ash in front of them. By morning, this single uprising will become the most successful slave revolt in recorded history. And the cause of it all, the reason a French colony is burning to the ground tonight, is sitting in almost every kitchen on earth right now, completely unnoticed, completely unquestioned. Is sugar. Here's the twist nobody expects. This plant that just burned down an empire didn't start as a treasure. It didn't start as a spice or a luxury or even as food for people at all. 10,000 years before that fire, on a Pacific island most people couldn't find on a map, this same plant was being grown for one purpose only: pig feed. That's where this story actually begins. Not with kings, not with conquest. With pigs. Around 8,000 years before the modern era, on the humid coastlines of New Guinea, Papuan farmers noticed something in the wild grass growing along their riverbanks. Some stalks were tougher, drier, better for building. Others were softer, juicier. They started choosing the soft ones. Generation after generation, they bred that grass on purpose, selecting for one trait only, sweetness, until they had built something the world had never seen before. A cultivated sugarcane plant, engineered by human hands, thousands of years before anyone on Earth had a word for engineering. Nobody involved in that process had any idea what they were building. They weren't trying to invent a global commodity. They were trying to make better pig feed and maybe get a sweet treat out of it for themselves. Picture a farmer peeling back the tough outer bark of a cane stalk with his teeth, biting into the fiber's center, sucking the sweet juice out the way a child gnaws on a stick of raw cane at a market today. That is the entire sugar industry at its absolute origin. A stick, a mouth, a moment of unexpected sweetness in a hard world. From there, something remarkable happened. Sailors began carrying cuttings of this plant with them on their canoes as they migrated across the Pacific. Historians call it a canoe plant, something valuable enough that seafaring people refused to leave it behind. Island by island, this sweet grass spread outward from New Guinea into Indonesia, into the Philippines, and eventually, by around 1,000 years before the modern era, into India and southern China. For thousands of years, that's all sugar ever was. Something you chewed. Something perishable, local, and completely unstirable. If nothing else had happened, this story would end here as a footnote about ancient snack food. But something else happened. It happened in India, and it changed the entire trajectory of human history. Subscribe to BeforeCommon right now, because what you're about to hear is the exact moment an ordinary grass turned into something worth more than gold. Somewhere around the 4th century, during the golden age of India's Gupta Empire, someone figured out how to crush the cane, boil the juice down, and let it cool into hard, granulated crystals. Historians believe simpler versions of this process may go back even further, centuries earlier. But this is the moment the process matured into something reliable, something repeatable. And that single discovery changed everything, because a crystal doesn't spoil the way juice does. A crystal can sit in a jar for years. A crystal can survive a voyage across an ocean. The Sanskrit word for this new granulated sugar was sharkara. Say that word slowly and you'll hear something familiar hiding inside it. It traveled through Persian, through Arabic, through medieval Latin and French, and eventually became the English word sugar. A second Sanskrit word, khanda, meaning a broken fragment of raw sugar, became the root of another word you already know: candy. Two of the sweetest words in the English language are fossils, buried remnants of an Indian breakthrough almost 1,700 years old. To the Greeks and Romans who encountered it in trade, this crystallized sugar wasn't even treated as food. It was treated as medicine, something rare, dosed carefully to settle an upset stomach, more comparable to an imported pharmaceutical than anything you'd sprinkle on breakfast. Indian merchants, moving along the same trade routes that carried silk and spices, carried this new crystallized product outward across Asia. And by the 6th century it reached Persia, where engineers built irrigation canals and water-powered mills in a much drier climate, just to keep this valuable new crop alive. Persia was about to become the next relay station in sugar's journey west. And the empire that took it from there was about to turn sugar from a rare Persian export into something that would eventually reach the tables of medieval European kings, carried home not by merchants, but by soldiers returning from holy war. The Arabs who conquered Persia in the 7th century inherited its sugar fields, and they didn't just keep the industry alive, they transformed it. Across a period historians call the Arab Agricultural Revolution, engineers and chemists across the Islamic world built elaborate water-powered mills, refined the crystallization process, and spread cane cultivation from Mesopotamia into Egypt, North Africa, Sicily, Cyprus, and southern Spain. For the first time in history, sugar had something behind it that wasn't luxury or curiosity. It had industry, dedicated plantations, dedicated merchants, dedicated infrastructure. And on the other side of that frontier in Christian Europe, almost none of it existed. Medieval European kingdoms had honey and little else. They were, in the words of food historians, essentially sugar blind, completely cut off from a substance that was already reshaping economies just across the Mediterranean. That changed with an army, not a merchant ship. Beginning in 1096, waves of crusaders marched into the Holy Land, and there they encountered something they had never seen before. A strange, bamboo-like reed being crushed and boiled down into a mysterious white and brown crystalline powder. They didn't have a word for it, so they made one up. Sweet salt. Picture the scene. A European knight, exhausted from months of campaign, is handed a small crystal by a local merchant in the markets of the Levant. He touches it to his tongue, expecting salt, expecting something familiar. Instead, his whole face changes. One soldier reportedly turned to another and said, in effect, "This is not of this earth, this is something from paradise itself." That reaction, recorded again and again in accounts from the period, is not exaggeration. These men had never tasted concentrated sweetness in their entire lives. When the First Crusade captured Jerusalem in 1099, small quantities of this sweet salt were carried back to Europe as trophies of war. That same year, sugar was recorded in England for the first time in history. For the next 2 centuries, it stayed almost impossibly rare, dosed out to monarchs, popes, and the wealthiest merchant families, treated less like food and more like a fine imported spice. European nobility, wanting to flaunt their wealth in the most extravagant way imaginable, commissioned entire sculptures made out of sugar for royal banquets. Think about that. The cheapest, most disposable ingredient in a modern kitchen was once so rare that kings built art out of it just to prove they could afford to. Venetian merchants smelled opportunity in all of this and built trading posts across the eastern Mediterranean specifically to control access to it. Sugar crept slowly westward into Cyprus, into Sicily, and eventually onto a remote volcanic island off the coast of Africa called Madeira. This is where the story takes a turn almost nobody expects. Because what happened on Madeira and on the Canary Islands right beside it was not a footnote. It was a rehearsal. Subscribe to BeforeCommon because the next part of this story is the actual blueprint for everything that came after it, tested on a small island most people have never heard of. Beginning around 1420, Portuguese sailors colonized the uninhabited island of Madeira and began growing cane using techniques borrowed straight from the Islamic world. Because the island was small and mountainous, the plantations stayed modest, but the labor system built to run them did not stay small in its cruelty. Enslaved Moroccans, enslaved Berbers, enslaved black Africans, and enslaved Canary Islanders were forced to work those fields alongside free Portuguese migrants. The Canary Islands, conquered by Spain across the same century, went even further. Modern historians describe them plainly as a testing ground for European colonialism. Everything that would later be unleashed on an entire hemisphere was assembled there first, piece by piece. The violent conquest of an inhabited population, the native Guanche people. The clearing of ancient forests to make way for cane fields. The importation of enslaved labor to replace a collapsing native population. Water-powered mills built at scale, purely to keep up with European demand for something sweet. And here is the detail that changes how you should think about the man everyone learned about in school. By the time Christopher Columbus set sail on his second voyage in 1493, he was not a stranger to any of this. He had lived and worked in Madeira for years. He knew the sugar trade personally, intimately, before he ever crossed an ocean. His ships stopped at Madeira and the Canary Islands specifically to restock, and it was there that he loaded refined sugar, valued at the time as medicine, and live sugarcane cuttings onto his ships. Those cuttings were planted at his short-lived settlement of La Isabela, on the northern coast of Hispaniola. The first plantings failed. But within 2 decades, new plantings succeeded, and the foundation of an entire hemisphere's plantation system was laid down on American soil for the very first time. Everything that followed, Brazil, Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, was the exact same Madeira and Canary Islands template, simply scaled up to a size the world had never seen. A rehearsal on a small island had just become the opening act for the largest forced migration of human beings in history. Sugarcane does not behave like most crops. It cannot be grown a little at a time by a family on a small plot and still turn a profit. Cutting, milling, and boiling the juice all have to happen within hours of each other at massive volume, on a schedule dictated by the plant's own chemistry, not by anyone's convenience. That single agricultural fact is the root of everything that follows. Sugar is only profitable at enormous scale, worked by enormous numbers of people. And European colonizers were about to answer that demand in the most brutal way imaginable. The Portuguese moved first, building the earliest large-scale sugar operation in the New World in Brazil in the 1530s. They called it an engenho, a mill surrounded by vast fields, and it became the exact blueprint the Dutch, the English, and the French would copy across the entire Caribbean over the following century. At first, colonizers tried forcing enslaved indigenous Americans into these fields. Disease, carried by the same Europeans who brought it, devastated those populations before the system could even take hold. Next, they tried European indentured servants. But indentured Europeans could negotiate. They had contracts, and there were never enough of them willing to endure conditions this severe for long. So colonizers turned to something else entirely. The wholesale, deliberate, calculated importation of enslaved Africans, torn from their homes and forced across an ocean in a crossing historians call the Middle Passage. Picture the hold of one of these ships. No light. No room to stand. The stench of human waste and disease in air that never moves. Men and women chained side by side to strangers for weeks, sometimes months, not knowing if they would ever see land again. Historians estimate that between 15 and 25% of the enslaved Africans forced onto these ships died before they ever reached shore. Between the 1620s and the 1850s, somewhere between 11 and 12 million enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic in total. Of those millions, historians estimate that as much as 2/3 were destined specifically for sugar plantations in Brazil, the Caribbean, and later Louisiana. Let that sit for a moment. Sugar wasn't a side effect of the slave trade. Sugar was, more than any other single product on earth, the reason the slave trade existed at the scale it did. The historian David Bryan Davis put it in the plainest terms possible. Sugar, he wrote, became the principal incentive for transporting millions of Africans to the New World. On the plantations themselves, the brutality was not incidental, it was arithmetic. Plantation owners calculated, in writing in their own ledgers, that it was often cheaper to work an enslaved person to death within a few years and simply purchase a replacement off the next arriving ship, than to keep that same person alive long enough to raise a family. Enslaved workers cut 9 and 10-foot cane stalks with double-edged knives under a punishing tropical sun, hauled them to mills, and tended boiling houses filled with open flame and scalding syrup, in conditions that made sugar production one of the deadliest forms of forced labor anywhere in the history of the Americas. This fed a system historians call the triangular trade. Manufactured goods sailed from Europe to West Africa, traded for captive human beings. Those captives were carried across the Middle Passage to be sold into sugar labor. And the sugar, along with its byproduct molasses, sailed back to Europe and New England, where the molasses was distilled into rum, some of which sailed back to Africa to purchase the next group of captives. Around and around for roughly 2.5 centuries. By the height of this machine, in 16th century Jamaica, 60% of enslaved people on the island were working sugar. By the 19th century that number had climbed to 90%. Sugar had become, quite literally, the single biggest reason a human being might find themselves in chains at all. Subscribe to BeforeCommon right now because everything you just heard was building toward one single night, one colony, and one uprising that would shake every slaveholding empire on earth to its foundation. No colony shows the scale of this system better than Saint-Domingue, the French colony on the island of Hispaniola. By the late 1700s, it was the richest colony on the entire planet, producing roughly 40% of all the sugar and 60% of all the coffee imported into Europe. This single Caribbean colony generated more revenue for France than all 13 North American colonies combined generated for Great Britain. That wealth sat on top of an enslaved population outnumbering free colonists by more than 10 to 1, roughly 500,000 enslaved people held under a system historians describe as among the harshest, most violent slave regimes anywhere in the Americas. Staggering wealth. Extreme brutality. A population where the enslaved vastly outnumbered their enslavers. It was, in hindsight, a combustible situation waiting for a spark. On the night of August 21, 1791, following a secret ceremony attended by more than 200 enslaved people at a place called BeforeCommon, that spark finally came. Picture the gathering in the dark, deep in a forest clearing, voices low, the air thick with fear and fury built up over generations. Within hours, word spread across the northern plains. Within weeks, the uprising had grown to more than 100,000 participants, and hundreds of plantations, the exact same wealth machine that had made Saint-Domingue the richest colony on earth, were burning to the ground. This was not a riot. It followed years of smaller rebellions and deliberate organizing by enslaved people, some of whom, according to historical accounts, had worked in supervisory roles on the plantations and understood the system from the inside. What followed was over a decade of war. Enslaved rebels fought French colonial forces, fought off opportunistic British and Spanish troops trying to exploit French weakness, and eventually fought Napoleon Bonaparte's own army, sent specifically to reconquer the colony and, many historians believe, to reinstate slavery outright. Led at different points by figures including Toussaint Louverture, the rebellion accomplished something that had never once succeeded anywhere in the Atlantic slave system before. Total victory. In 1804, the former colony declared full independence, discarding its French name, and adopting instead an old indigenous word for the island, Haiti. It became, and remains to this day, the only nation in world history founded directly out of a successful slave revolution. The shockwaves went everywhere at once. Fleeing white planters carried terrified stories of the uprising to other Caribbean islands and to the United States, hardening slaveholding attitudes across the hemisphere for decades, out of pure fear that any concession might spark the same result elsewhere. At the very same time, for enslaved people across the Americas, Haiti became living proof that the system could be beaten. Sugar built the richest colony the world had ever seen. And sugar, and the people forced to grow it, burned that same colony down, and in doing so gave birth to the first free black republic in modern history. Subscribe to BeforeCommon because the next twist in this story comes from somewhere you'd never expect. Not a battlefield. A laboratory. In 1747, a Berlin chemist named Andreas Sigismund Marggraf discovered something strange in his laboratory. Ordinary beet roots, the same bland vegetable grown across cold northern Europe, contained sucrose chemically identical to that of tropical sugarcane. At the time, almost nobody cared. The sugar content in his test beets was tiny, and cheap slave-grown Caribbean sugar was already flooding European markets. Why bother? Then Napoleon Bonaparte happened. In 1806, after his navy was crushed at Trafalgar and an invasion of Britain became impossible, Napoleon launched an economic war instead, an embargo called the Continental Blockade, sealing off Europe from British ships and British-controlled goods. Sugar was one of the biggest casualties, since Britain controlled roughly 80% of the entire European sugar supply. Napoleon had just accidentally starved his own continent of one of its most craved luxuries. French scientists scrambled for any domestic alternative, experimenting even with potatoes and mushrooms before circling back to that old, mostly forgotten beet research. Two French chemists, Benjamin de Lessert and Jean-Baptiste Quirwell, took Marggraf's original process and dramatically improved its efficiency. When Napoleon personally saw the results, he moved fast. In 1811, he decreed that 32,000 hectares of French farmland be planted with sugar beets, and threw the full weight of the French state behind the new industry. Within 2 years, the number of beet sugar factories in France exploded from 4 to roughly 300. Here is the twist worth sitting with. An emperor trying to economically strangle his greatest rival, with absolutely no humanitarian motive whatsoever, had just handed Europe the ability to grow its own sugar for the very first time in history, permanently loosening the tropics' centuries-long monopoly, and quietly chipping away at one of the economic arguments that had propped up plantation slavery in the first place. But formal abolition, when it finally came across the British Empire in the 1830s, did not end the demand for cheap forced labor on sugar plantations. just changed its legal name. Newly freed men and women, understandably, refused to keep cutting cane for the same poverty wages colonial planters were offering. So the British Empire engineered a replacement. Indentured servitude, recruiting laborers from India and China under multi-year contracts promising passage, housing, and wages, in exchange for years of bonded labor on the exact same plantations. Between 1834 and 1917, somewhere between 1.3 and 2 million Indian indentured laborers were shipped to colonies including Mauritius, Fiji, Trinidad, and Guyana, alongside separate flows of Chinese contract laborers sent to Cuba and Peru. Legally, this was not slavery. In practice, according to extensive historical documentation, it frequently looked exactly like it. Recruiters used deception and outright coercion to sign workers up. Laborers were transported in crowded ships under conditions echoing the Middle Passage itself. Corporal punishment and crushing debt were common. Recorded annual death rates hit 12% in Jamaica in 1870, a figure still holding roughly 3 decades later in Mauritius. Children as young as 5 worked fields alongside their indentured parents. The story of forced human labor moving across oceans to grow something sweet did not end with abolition. It simply continued under a new legal name for another 8 decades. By the 20th century, sugar's power to shape entire nations hadn't disappeared. It just changed battlefields, moving from empire versus empire to a much colder, quieter kind of war. Cuba had been growing sugarcane since 1523, and by the early 1900s its entire economy revolved around it, a dependency historians call monoculture, meaning the whole nation's fate rose and fell with the world price of one single crop. For decades, that dependency ran through the United States, whose sugar consumption doubled between 1903 and 1925 and pulled American investment deep into Cuban plantations. Then, in 1959, everything changed. Fidel Castro's government began seizing American-owned businesses on the island, and President Dwight Eisenhower struck back the only way that truly mattered. He canceled roughly 700,000 tons of Cuba's remaining sugar quota to the United States, aiming directly at the one product Cuba's survival depended on. Within days, the Soviet Union stepped into the gap and offered to buy every ton the Americans had just refused. Cuba retaliated by seizing the 3 largest American-owned sugar mills on the island. By 1964, Havana and Moscow had signed a long-term deal fixing Soviet purchases of Cuban sugar at nearly double the world market price, an arrangement that functioned less like ordinary trade and more like a direct subsidy, tying Cuba's economic survival to Moscow's willingness to keep overpaying year after year, in exchange for political loyalty. When the Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991, that subsidy vanished almost overnight, plunging Cuba into what the country still calls its special period, a catastrophic collapse rooted, in large part, in decades of dependence on the price of one sweet crop. An entire nation's survival for 3 decades quite literally hinged on sugar. Subscribe to BeforeCommon because the next chapter of this story is the one that will make you look at your own kitchen differently. This is where the sugar industry stopped fighting empires and started fighting science itself. By the 1950s, a growing body of research had begun linking sugar to coronary heart disease, one of the biggest killers in the industrialized world. That was a direct commercial threat, and the American sugar industry responded exactly the way you'd expect a threatened industry to respond. In 1954, the president of the trade group then known as the Sugar Research Foundation stood in front of executives and described, in plain language, a great business opportunity. Convinced the public that fat, not sugar, was the real dietary villain behind heart disease. In 1965, that same organization approached the chair of Harvard's own School of Public Health Nutrition Department and commissioned a literature review on sugar, fat, and heart disease, handpicking which existing studies would even be included. 3 Harvard researchers were paid the equivalent of roughly $50,000 in today's money to produce it. Surviving letters show the sugar industry's own executive closely tracking drafts as they came in. When he finally got the version he wanted, he wrote back to the scientists directly. "Let me assure you," he said, "this is quite what we had in mind." In another letter, one of the paid researchers complained that independent scientists in Iowa kept publishing new evidence linking sugar to heart disease, forcing him, in his own words, to rework a section in rebuttal, actively editing around inconvenient truths rather than following them. The final review was published in 1967 in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most trusted medical journals on the planet, concluding that sugar's link to heart disease was limited, and that only fat and cholesterol needed to change. The sugar industry's funding was never disclosed. Medical journals didn't require that disclosure until 1984, 17 years later. One of the paid researchers went on to help draft the earliest version of the United States government's official dietary guidelines in 1977, guidelines that, for decades, told American families to fear fat while staying quiet about sugar. A nutrition researcher who later reviewed these documents put it simply. Industry-funded research, she said, almost invariably produces results that confirm the benefits, or the lack of harm, of whoever is paying for it. That single quietly purchased study helped shape what an entire generation of families believed was a healthy diet. That cover-up wasn't the end of the story either. What happened next, starting in the 1970s, is the reason sugar became harder to avoid than at almost any point in the last 10,000 years. American food and beverage manufacturers began mass-producing a brand new industrial sweetener, high-fructose corn syrup, made by chemically converting cornstarch into a fructose-rich syrup. It was cheaper than cane or beet sugar, and it was heavily favored by government policy that subsidized domestic corn while taxing imported cane sugar. Between 1970 and 1990, American consumption of this one ingredient exploded by more than 1,000%, one of the fastest dietary shifts ever recorded, and by the century's turn it had become the single caloric sweetener in most major American soft drinks. Scientists still genuinely disagree about how much blame belongs to this one ingredient specifically, versus the simple explosion in total sugar consumption of every kind, alongside bigger portions and less physical activity. That debate is real and honest and still unresolved. What is far less disputed is this. Global consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages has climbed sharply since 1990 and is projected to keep climbing through 2050, consistently linked across a massive body of research to obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, and dental disease. In the United States, adult obesity rates that were once a marginal concern have surged to the point where, in recent measurements, more than 35% of adults in some states are classified as obese. So here is the entire arc of this story, laid out from beginning to end. A wild grass, selectively bred by anonymous farmers on a Pacific island 10,000 years ago for no reason more ambitious than making pig feed sweeter, traveled by canoe, by camel caravan, by crusading army, by slave ship, by cargo container, across every inhabited continent on Earth. Along the way it built the richest colony ever recorded. It fueled the forced transportation of millions of human beings across an ocean. It was burned into revolution by the very people enslaved to grow it. It was accidentally set free from the tropics by an emperor trying to starve his own enemy. It anchored a superpower rivalry through 3 decades of Cold War. Its health risks were quietly buried by paid science in the very decade the modern diet was being designed. And it finally arrived, cheaper, more abundant, and more deeply engineered into the food supply than at any point in its 10,000-year history, sitting in the pantry of almost every household on this planet, including yours. The next time you stir a spoonful into your coffee, you'll know exactly how far it traveled to get there, and exactly what it cost along the way. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the story hiding behind the ordinary things you never think twice about, subscribe to BeforeCommon right now and turn on notifications because the next secret origin is already waiting for you.